by the second half of the 19th century, Germany and the United States were the two big up-and-coming economic powerhouses, both of whom, in their different ways, challenging the dominant economic power of that time, the British Empire. World War I changed that. The German working class, which had felt itself to be the most educated, the most sophisticated, the most modern, and in many ways they were. The German working class who had seen the 20th century as the new century in which they would really rise to their full potential. These were German working class families that had done well enough in the 19th century to have real savings. The Germans were and are very frugal people. They really felt that they were on the cusp of being the great German Empire. They had acquired some colonies in Africa and elsewhere by that time, so they were competing globally with countries like England and France, who had been doing it for a longer time. Everything was smashed in World War I. No one had prepared the German working class for the possibility, let alone the reality, that they would fight a war and they would lose. And in those years, from when the loss became clear, 1917, 1918, in the years that followed, the German working class suffered what can only be called a trauma. And of course, I'm doing this because I'm going to show you that the United States isn't so different. But back to Germany. What happened? They lost the war. Part of the punishment of being the loser in the war was that their colonies were taken away from them and given to France or Britain and so on. More than that, they were forced to pay reparations, huge punishment fines after the war was over that they had to pay for years after the war to the countries that had defeated them, above all, Britain and France. Britain and France had borrowed from the United States to fight the war, so they used the reparations Germany gave them to pay back their loans to the United States. So the U.S., Western Europe, all lived off of, in large part, the Germans who paid reparations. In part because that bankrupted Germany, they suffered an inflation, the worst inflation any modern industrialized economy has faced in the last several centuries. During the year 1923, the German currency went from about 6 or 7 to a US dollar to $1 billion for a US dollar. Germans took their paycheck in a bag, paper currency in a bag at midday lunch break, ran home, gave it to someone in their family who would run to the store to spend that money, because if you didn't spend it right away, by the end of the day, it wouldn't be worth anything. Prices were doubling every 45 minutes. Americans have no idea what such a thing can be, but I'm talking about something literally a century ago. This is not ancient history. But what it did was wipe out the savings of the German working class. In 1 year, gone. You may have saved for 50 years across 3 generations, and what you had saved was now enough to buy maybe a quarter pound of butter. That was 1923. A few years later, 6 years later, the Great Depression hit, the collapse of global capitalism, 1929. And what had not been destroyed by the war and by the inflation was completely destroyed by the Depression, which threw millions of Germans out of work. It was too much for any working class to suffer. Everything destroyed. Your savings, your job, your income, your community, your hopes, your future, everything. And that created a desperation. The difference was they didn't lose World War I, so it continued, and they didn't lose World War II. And indeed, after World War II, the American working class enjoyed a situation that no working class had had before. high and rising standard of living, high and rising wages. The American working class, like the Germans before them, thought that this would never end, thought that this would last forever, thought that they were the special United States, the exception where enterprise would succeed and where wages would rise. And then came 1970. And in the 1970s, all of that came to an end. It wasn't a war, the way it had done it to the German working class, but it was something just as bad. Three things happened in the 1970s and 80s that changed everything. Number one, a technical revolution. The computer, then the robot, then artificial intelligence, wiping out millions of jobs. And where? In the best paid white male industrial workers, the ones who had strong unions. Number two, many of those jobs that didn't disappear with automation were relocated to China, to Brazil, to India. Millions of jobs lost to relocation, because companies could make more profits producing with lower wage workers over there, so they went there. They could make more profits by serving the big markets over there, which were growing faster than the American one by that time. And finally, the immigrants who came in desperate because of the changes in their society, looking for jobs, willing to work under poorer conditions and lower wages than Americans had gotten used to. A 1-2-3 punch. Automation, relocation, immigration. And for white, well-paid, male, unionized American workers in manufacturing, it was as devastating a trauma as that suffered by the German working class from 1918 to 1929. And the problem in the United States was like what happened in Germany. The two political parties were useless. The Republican Party was a cheerleader for the automation and the relocation and the immigration, and so was the Democratic Party. They had been captured by the big businesses who wanted to replace workers with machines because it was profitable, who wanted to move jobs out of the country because it was profitable, who wanted to hire low-wage immigrants because it was profitable, and who did all that, and who made sure the two political parties whom they funded didn't stand in the way. We cheered on globalization. We cheered on all of the engineers we hyped and to whom we showered praise and money and opportunity. Meanwhile, the conditions of the mass of Americans deteriorated, particularly, again, the white, male, unionized manufacturing workers. Not only them, but mostly them. And they turned to the two political parties and they got nothing. Meanwhile, after long suffering, oppressed groups in the United States, women who were second-class citizens, economically for sure, black and brown people, ditto, were struggling to have their place in the United States and were making enough noise that the political parties paid some attention to them. Didn't help them a lot, didn't help them very quickly, but helped them a little and with a lot of symbolic. And you know what that did? That freaked out the white, male, unemployed man who began to feel, I'm not worth helping, but these other people are. And when that situation arose, there would always be, in this country as elsewhere, demagogues, political hustlers who saw in this emerging tension an opportunity. Tell the working class that your enemy is those black and brown people, the women too, the ones getting ahead. They're taking your job. Why would the Republicans and the Democrats, one loudly, one softly, say such things? They would say them because neither of them has the courage to attack the businesses whose profit-maximizing strategy lies behind all of this. Businesses chose to go to China. No one held a gun to their face. Businesses chose to get rid of jobs for technology. No one held a gun to their head. Businesses looked for opportunities to rip off immigrants by paying them less. But it worked. The demagogues arose. In Germany, the demagogue was Adolf Hitler. He told the German people, you got two enemies, the Jews and foreigners. Mr. Trump arose and told us immigrants and foreigners, very similar. He turned the upset, the genuine suffering of white, male, manufacturing workers against women, blacks, and browns. Easy with American history. Hitler found it easy to turn Germans against foreigners and Jews, too, because that existed for a long time. Anti-Semitism in Germany, as elsewhere in Europe. Notice the similarities. Eventually, the hostility that was initially a way of moving ahead politically, this antipathy to Jews, got so hysterical on the part of these people like Hitler that he literally exterminated millions of people in ovens. Mr. Trump isn't there yet, but he has empowered the equivalent of stormtroopers. That's what they were called in Germany. The ice folks, the people who treat immigrants in an unbelievably callous way, faces covered, no ideas, acting as if they have the authority to bully, to hurt, to export, to deport without due process of any kind. That's what Hitler's SS did too. That's what the Gestapo did too. You're caught up in your own ideological craziness, as I have tried to argue here and as many others have. The problems of the American economy have very little to do with immigration. They're too few, they're too poor, they couldn't possibly explain the difficulties of white, male manufacturing workers in this country, any more than Jews had much to do with the crisis of Germany's working class. It takes an extraordinarily, how shall I say, a person with a very ambiguous relationship with the truth, to start babbling, to get people's misery to turn them against other people and make them miserable, too. We're not at it. We're not yet fascistic, but we have made many of the steps that go in that direction because we have many of the qualities of a difficult economy pushing us that way. And no leaders, no Democrat and no Republican, able or willing to stand up and say what I've been saying. Nothing I'm saying here is secret. Everything is available in the history books. That's where I learned it too. And why is that? Why was the left well organized in Germany and poorly organized here? Because after World War II, after the Great New Deal, the business community and the right wing in America went to work to destroy the organizations of the American left. One communist, two socialist party, and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the greatest labor union drive in American history. We never had anything like that before. We've never had one since. All those organizations were destroyed after 1945. Their people arrested, their people hounded out of the country, their people hounded out of their jobs. You called yourself a communist or a socialist, you could kiss your job goodbye, and worse. The CIO represented nearly a third of the American working class. Today it represents a tenth. Everything has been done to break those organizations down. And so we are defenseless against Mr. Trump, aren't we? He doesn't have to yet deploy full fascism. So we don't have it yet. But if you want to see its beginnings, notice that the ICE people seem entitled to have masks so you can't identify them, to deny you their names when you ask for them, to behave in a way we permit no other police to behave. We have a special police. That's what Hitler did too. We're not there yet, but the conditions that brought us to this place are very similar. In the end, Mr. Hitler went so far in exterminating Jews to produce a horror around the world that came back to undo Mr. Hitler. Likewise, his hatred of foreigners led him to believe that the German army could walk across Poland and Russia and Czechoslovakia and all those other places, and he tried, and he was defeated. War and extermination of state scapegoat. Does it sound similar? Are we trying to exterminate our immigrant population? Are we moving in that direction? Have Mr. Trump's spectacular inability to end the war in Ukraine, which he promised to do, to end the war of the Jewish leaders of Israel against the Palestinians in Gaza, that hasn't come to an end. That's gotten worse. Mr. Trump spoke of endless wars. Right. That too was a feature of Mr. Hitler that brought him down. Turned out the extermination of a scapegoat and the attack on foreigners is very fascistic, leads in fascistic directions, but it also points to that which in the end ends fascism. In 1945, Mr. Hitler vanished, either by suicide or in some other way we'll never know. But the German experience with fascism was over. From 1933 to 1945, 12 years. Could have been very different. Has been very different ever since. Will the United States stay on the road it has been on to have yet more similarities to fascism? Not yet, but the analogy takes on more relevance with each passing month. This is not a sign of a calm, collected. This is desperation economics. And if you doubted it, the on again, off again just shows you how desperate they are. 2 days of something, Monday it has to be reversed because the bond market goes crazy. And then Wednesday it has to be reversed because our allies are going to hurt us back. The Chinese showing it, even the Europeans, courageless as they so often nowadays are, thinking maybe to find some resort. But this is not the United States of the 20th century. This is the United States going down and flailing around with these gestural policies, on again, off again. Let me remind everyone, 70 years ago, China was among the poorest countries on this planet. It was an exemplar of the depth of poverty. It was the place that Pearl Buck described in her book, The Good Earth, as almost beyond human suffering, the level of difficulty for their people. And over the last 75 years, and particularly over the last 30 or 35 years, they have become one of the economic powerhouses of the modern world. Why in the world would you want to call that not what it is, what Michael says, success? Of course it's success. They've become the manufacturing center of the world in that period of time. It blows my mind. I recently saw a map of bullet trains in China, the complex network of their super fast trains. The only thing in the United States that comes close is the Acela, the train line that runs from Boston to Washington, which is only slightly faster than the convention. We basically have no bullet trains. And they've connected every place in China with bullet trains. By the way, Michael reminds us, what was the big breakthrough of the 19th century? The trains, which unified the country, which opened up the Midwest to the rest of the world so it could become the food producer, the grain producer, transforming everybody else. The Chinese are the success story of our time. You know, earlier government administrations in the United States wanted to make the Chinese change their regime, change their system. We justified bringing them into the World Trade Organization because that was going to make them like us. But there's no reason for them to be like us. They don't want to have slow economic growth. In 2024, according to the IMF, U.S. economic growth about 2.8%, Chinese economic growth about 5%. And now I know there'll be the conventional nonsense about how you can't trust Chinese numbers. I have heard that story uninterrupted for 30 years. Now it's beginning to fade away, since obviously it was nonsense all along, and it's nonsense now. And by the way, those are IMF numbers, not numbers from China. So the crucial reality here is that it's the American government that's in trouble. It's the American empire that's declining, and it's the American capitalist system that has dug itself into a hole. If for the last 40, 50 years you have run a trade imbalance, which we basically have since the 1970s, and you've paid for it by a massive export of dollars that come back as debt, you're deepening a level of debt that will one day lead people to hesitate to absorb more debt. That's what happened on Monday of this week. That's why the bond market freaked them all out.
How do you characterize the U.S. donor class, as Michael was talking about, and its influence on policy?
They seem to me to live in a fantasy world, that they can do things that clearly they can't do anymore. For me, the overwhelmingly interesting thing is, as I keep saying, that they live in a world in which the United States' economic, political, ideological, cultural, and military position are weakening. That's why the military strategists keep saying time is on China's side, not ours, in this conflict. But he doesn't want to face any of that. He's going to do this, that, and the other thing. No, he isn't. It isn't going to work for him. A declining empire does not have the options that a rising empire does. The last time we tried with the tariffs was in a time of the rising U.S. empire. That's gone. That's over. We didn't have a major competitor on the scale that the Chinese are today back then. And by the way, Mr. McKinley got the tariff through when he was a representative. By the time he became a president, he turned against the policy of tariffs because he got into too much difficulty from the very class that Michael is talking about. Michael is right. There's no question that deep below all of the rest of this BS is a desire to avoid what for him is a catastrophe, which is the expiration of the tax cut that was passed in 2017. If that is allowed to expire, and that legislation has a self-ending, I believe on the 31st of December of this year. So if he doesn't get that problem solved, his donor class will get an enormous tax increase comparable to the one decrease that they got 8 years ago. So he has to deal with that. And Michael is also right. He's promised more tax cuts on top of making sure that that other tax cut doesn't expire. And given that we are already projected to have almost a $2 trillion deficit now, he's looking at unbelievable risks of a bond market breakdown because people won't lend to the United States anymore because it's too dangerous to do. It is what happened to Liz Truss in England not so long ago. She tried to come up with a budget that looked like, oh, we will borrow more. No, said the bond market, we're not going to lend you anymore. And her proposal disappeared, and she disappeared. She's gone out of politics in Britain. I don't make predictions, but Mr. Trump, who has had in the long historical sweep of things a meteoric rise to the top, could very well now be on the cusp of an equally meteoric rise down into oblivion, because this doesn't work. There is an element here that people should understand. To the degree that people and businesses around the world lower their prices in order to hold on to the American market, despite the tariffs, then Mr. Trump will have achieved at least a part of what he's after. He will have made the rest of the world pay a tribute to the United States, because that's what it is. You want to do business here, you pay us. And the way you pay us is you lower the price of your exports here. That way the American people can keep buying them. The price will not go up, and the revenues from the tariffs will be paid to the American government, and it will be at the expense of the foreigners. They don't want it. They will be looking to every way to evade it. They will be likely to be successful. So the end result is that Mr. Trump will get a small portion of the fantasy he thinks is waiting there for him. That's, for me, what's going on. And again, only get it if the rest of the world pays tribute. And that is going to make every other leader receive the rage and the bitterness of all those other countries who are being required to pay that tribute. And that's a wellspring of hostility that makes the United States, not China, the world's rogue nation in everybody's mind, U.S. allies and enemies alike. This is an extraordinarily risky ploy to undertake. Yes, I think that the Chinese have become much more confident because they ought to. It's the logical inference from what they have experienced. At least as far back as Obama, we know from the statements made by Obama, those around him, and everybody in power since, that we need to, quote unquote, pivot to Asia, that the American adversary now is China. And everything has been done imaginable, whether it's stationing the Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea or rediscovering this dead horse called Taiwan and that issue, or the series of sanctions, the series of tariffs by Trump, then worsened by Biden. I want to remind people, Biden not only did not undo what Trump did, he raised it. In the case of the electric cars that I think I've mentioned before on our program, the BYD company's electric cars have 100% tariff. They've had it already from Mr. Biden. They didn't wait for this crazy last few days. 100% was already a Democratic contribution. And what do the last 10 or 15 years, because that's what it's been, 10 or 15 years of effort to stop Chinese growth. It has failed. It hasn't done that. China is a bigger and more powerful force now than it was 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 5 years ago. The alliance it has constructed, the BRICS, is a bigger alliance, more powerful than before. You know, the BRICS produce now about 35% of total GDP in the world, whereas the G7, the United States and its major allies, produce about 27, 28%. And that gap is growing each year. The United States is not the dominant economic power anymore.
The only way to solve the problems of unemployment and poverty and all the other basic economic issues confronting the United States, which are now building to a crescendo as a desperate government. That's what Mr. Trump's regime represents. A desperate government reaches out and tries unorthodox things, tariffs, firing hundreds of thousands of public employees. These are extreme actions, and they reflect the extremity of the dangers and the crises that have accumulated. They are acts of desperation, however cleverly they are choreographed in front of your evening television news. That's what they are. They are attempts to reform. Mr. Trump's tariffs want to reform the entire global trading system. With Mr. Musk, he wants to reform the entire federal workforce. What it does, how it does it, who does it. These are dramatic reforms. But what you'll never hear from the Republicans
is one word about changing the capitalist system. And by that I mean, very simply, the arrangement in which in every factory, store, or office, a very small group of people, the board of directors if it's a corporation, the owner, the operator of the business, the partnership if that's what it is, they make all the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And of course, should surprise no one, they take care of themselves first. They're rich, you're not. They're powerful, you're not. They hire and fire, you don't. That's the difference. And the Republicans wouldn't say a word. But because of what happened after the Great Depression, the Democrats won't say a word about that either. During the last presidential election, neither Mr. Trump, nor Mr. Biden, nor Ms. Harris had one word to say about the employer-employee relationship and the imbalance of power and wealth inside every business that shows us. You want there not to be an abuse of the mass of working people, then you're going to have to face it. They're going to have to be in charge. If you don't want masters to abuse slaves, you've got to end slavery. If you don't want employers to abuse employees, you've got to end that relationship. That Mr. Trump got into the presidency by being the guy who's nasty, who refers to Mexicans as rapists, who all the things we know about him, being the naughty, being the one who says what others dare not say, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. That's his method of being. That's brought him to the White House. Why expect him to change? He'd have to understand that getting there is a different project from being there. And there's no sign that he has such an idea.